the harsh wilderness of 1840s Texas, where mercy was often mistaken for weakness and kindness could cost a man his life, one settler's simple act of compassion would test everything he believed about survival, humanity, and the thin line between civilization and chaos. What began as a moment of pity for a lost child would spiral into a deadly standoff that would change the course of frontier history and challenge every assumption about the legendary Comanche nation. Sometimes the greatest battles are won not with weapons, but with the courage to see the humanity in your enemy's eyes. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying grass across the Texas prairie as Samuel Harrison finished his evening chores. The year was 1847, and his small homestead sat like a lonely island in an ocean of untamed wilderness, 30 miles from the nearest settlement. At 42, Samuel had weathered enough frontier hardships to know that survival depended on routine, vigilance, and an unwavering trust in Providence. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he secured the barn door, checking twice that the latch held firm. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson that reminded him of the campfires his grandfather used to tend back in Virginia. Those were different times, when the frontier meant crossing the Appalachian Mountains rather than venturing into Comanche territory. Samuel often wondered what the old man would think of his grandson's decision to build a life in such a dangerous place, where neighbors were scarce, and hostile tribes still claimed dominion over vast stretches of land. His modest cabin stood testament to years of backbreaking labor. Built from local timber and chinked with mud and prairie grass, it wasn't much to look at, but it was solid enough to withstand the fierce Texas storms that swept across the plains. A small vegetable garden behind the house provided beans, corn, and squash, while his livestock consisted of 3 milk cows, a handful of chickens, and 2 horses that served as both transportation and early warning system for approaching danger. Samuel had lost his wife Margaret to fever 3 winters prior, and their only child, a son named Benjamin, had died in infancy. The loneliness sometimes pressed down on him like a physical weight, but he'd grown accustomed to the silence that filled his days. He found solace in simple tasks and honest work, believing that a man could find peace even in the most troubled circumstances if he maintained his faith and treated others with dignity. As he walked toward the cabin, the horses in the corral began to show signs of unease. Their ears pricked forward, and they moved restlessly around the small enclosure. Samuel paused, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle that he always carried during the evening hours. Living alone in Comanche country had taught him to pay attention to such signals. Horses could sense things that human ears and eyes might miss. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by occasional clusters of mesquite trees and the winding course of a small creek that provided water for his livestock. In the growing twilight, shadows seemed to shift and move, creating the illusion of movement where none existed. Samuel's experienced eyes scanned the landscape methodically, looking for anything that didn't belong. It was then that he saw her. A small figure emerged from behind a stand of trees near the creek, moving with the careful, deliberate steps of someone who was either injured or extremely cautious. As the figure drew closer, Samuel could see that it was a young girl, perhaps 12 or 13 years old. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, and she wore a simple dress that appeared to be made from buckskin. Even from a distance, he could tell that she was not a white settler's child. Samuel felt his heartbeat quicken. In this part of Texas, encountering a lone Comanche child could mean many things, none of them particularly reassuring. It could be a trap, with warriors hidden nearby waiting for him to lower his guard. It could be a scout sent ahead to assess his defenses before a raid, or it could simply be what it appeared to be, a lost child in need of help. The girl continued to approach, her movements becoming more hesitant as she drew closer to the cabin. Samuel could see now that she was limping slightly, favoring her left leg. Her dress was torn in several places, and there appeared to be scratches on her arms and face. She looked exhausted, as if she had been traveling for days without adequate rest or food. When she was perhaps 50 yards from the cabin, the girl stopped and looked directly at Samuel. Even across the distance, he could see the wariness in her posture, the way she held herself ready to flee at the first sign of hostility. For several long moments they simply regarded each other across the twilight prairie, 2 strangers separated by vast cultural differences, but connected by the basic human need for compassion. Samuel made a decision that would change the course of his life. Slowly, deliberately, he set his rifle down on the ground and took a step forward. The girl tensed, ready to run, but when he raised both hands in a gesture of peace and spoke in a gentle voice, she remained where she was. "It's all right," he said. knowing she probably couldn't understand his words but hoping his tone would convey his peaceful intentions. "I won't hurt you." The girl tilted her head slightly, studying his face with intelligent dark eyes that seemed older than her years. After another moment of hesitation, she took a tentative step forward, then another. Samuel remained perfectly still, allowing her to approach at her own pace. As she drew nearer, Samuel could see the extent of her injuries more clearly. The scratches on her arms and face appeared to be from thorns or branches, suggesting she had been traveling through heavy brush. Her moccasins were worn thin, and he could see that her feet were bleeding. Most concerning of all was the way she held her left arm close to her body, suggesting it might be injured. When the girl was close enough that he could have reached out and touched her, she stopped again. Up close, Samuel could see that she was younger than he had first thought, probably no more than 11 years old. Her face bore the high cheekbones and strong features characteristic of the Comanche people, but there was something else there too, a vulnerability that spoke to the parental instincts he thought he had buried with his own child. The girl said something in her native language, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel shook his head gently and pointed to himself. "Samuel," he said clearly, then pointed to her with a questioning expression. She watched his face carefully, as if trying to determine whether he could be trusted. After a long moment she spoke again, and this time Samuel caught what sounded like a name, Ayana. Samuel nodded and repeated the name, trying to pronounce it correctly. The girl's expression softened slightly, and she took another small step forward. It was then that Samuel noticed she was swaying on her feet, clearly struggling to remain upright. Without thinking, he reached out to steady her, but the girl flinched away from his touch. Samuel immediately pulled his hand back and instead gestured toward the cabin. "Food," he said, miming the action of eating. "Water." He cupped his hands and pretended to drink. The girl's eyes followed his gestures, and Samuel could see the hunger and thirst written plainly on her face. She was clearly debating whether to trust him, weighing her desperate need for help against the very real possibility that accepting his assistance could be dangerous. Samuel tried a different approach. He walked slowly to his garden and picked several ears of corn, then returned and held them out to her. Corn was a staple crop among the Comanche, and he hoped the familiar food might help put her at ease. The sight of the corn seemed to decide her. The girl reached out with her uninjured arm and accepted one of the ears, immediately beginning to eat the raw kernels with obvious hunger. As she ate, Samuel could see tears beginning to form in her eyes, though whether from relief, pain, or some other emotion, he couldn't tell. "Come," Samuel said gently, gesturing again toward the cabin. "It's getting cold out here, and you need somewhere warm to rest." This time, the girl didn't hesitate. She nodded and began to follow him toward the cabin, though she continued to glance around nervously, as if expecting danger to emerge from the gathering darkness. As they walked the short distance to his door, Samuel found himself wondering about the circumstances that had brought this child to his doorstep. The Comanche were known for their fierce independence and strong family bonds. For a young girl to be wandering alone, injured and hungry, suggested that something tragic had occurred. Perhaps her band had been attacked by soldiers or rival tribes. Perhaps she had become separated during a buffalo hunt or while traveling to winter quarters. The cabin felt smaller with another person inside, even one as small as Ayana. Samuel lit a lantern and gestured for her to sit on one of the simple wooden chairs he had made during his first winter on the homestead. The girl looked around the cabin with obvious curiosity, taking in the stone fireplace, the few pieces of furniture, and the various tools and supplies that represented Samuel's life in the wilderness. Samuel moved to the fireplace and began building a fire, conscious of the girl's eyes following his every movement. Once the flames caught hold, he hung a pot of water over the fire to heat, then went to his small pantry to gather food. He had dried beef, cornmeal, beans, and a small amount of precious sugar that he had been saving for special occasions. If this wasn't a special occasion, he reasoned, he didn't know what was. As he prepared a simple meal, Samuel found himself thinking about the risk he was taking. Harboring a Comanche child, even temporarily, could be seen as an act of treason by his fellow settlers. The Texas Rangers and local militia were engaged in an ongoing and bitter conflict with the various Comanche bands, and showing mercy to the enemy was often viewed as weakness or betrayal. But as he looked at Ayana huddled in the chair with her injured arm cradled against her body, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. She was a child first, and everything else second. His Christian faith demanded that he show compassion to those in need, regardless of their race or tribal affiliation. The meal was simple but filling. beans and cornbread with small pieces of dried beef mixed in. Samuel served it in his best wooden bowl and handed it to Ayanna along with a cup of water. The girl accepted the food gratefully and began to eat with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned not to waste anything edible. While she ate, Samuel examined her injured arm more closely. It wasn't broken, but there was significant swelling around the elbow, and the girl winced when she tried to move it. He had some experience with injuries from his years of frontier living, and he suspected it was a bad sprain that would heal with rest and care. Samuel heated water and used a clean cloth to gently clean the scratches on Ayanna's arms and face. The girl submitted to his ministrations without complaint, though he could feel the tension in her muscles and see the wariness that never quite left her eyes. When he was finished, he found some clean rags to use as bandages for the worst of the cuts. Communication remained a challenge, but they managed to work out a basic system of gestures and simple words. Samuel showed her where she could sleep, offering her his own bed while he prepared to spend the night in the chair by the fireplace. Ayanna shook her head vigorously at this suggestion and pointed to the floor near the fire, making it clear that she would prefer to sleep there. Samuel understood her reasoning. Sleeping on the floor would allow her to escape quickly if necessary, and the position near the fire would provide both warmth and light. He brought her a blanket and pillow, then banked the fire so it would burn through the night without requiring constant attention. As he settled into his chair for what he suspected would be a long and wakeful night, Samuel reflected on the day's extraordinary events. When he had awakened that morning, he could never have imagined that he would end the day sharing his cabin with a young Comanche girl. The situation was unprecedented in his experience, and he had no clear idea how it might resolve itself. The girl's presence raised immediate and troubling questions. Where had she come from? How had she become separated from her people? Most importantly, would anyone come looking for her? If Comanche warriors discovered that a white settler was harboring one of their children, the consequences could be severe not just for Samuel, but for other homesteaders in the region. Yet, as he watched Ayanna curl up beneath the blanket, her young face finally relaxing in sleep, Samuel felt a deep sense of rightness about his decision. Whatever dangers might arise from his act of compassion, he could not have turned away a child in need. His conscience would not have allowed it, nor would his faith. The fire crackled softly in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the wind continued to blow across the prairie, carrying with it the wild, untamed scent of the frontier. Samuel dozed fitfully in his chair, waking frequently to check on his unexpected guest and to listen for sounds that might indicate approaching danger. Near dawn, he was awakened by a soft sound from near the fireplace. Ayanna was sitting up, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders, staring into the dying flames. In the dim light, Samuel could see that she had been crying. "Bad dreams?" he asked quietly. The girl turned to look at him, and even though she couldn't understand his words, something in his tone seemed to comfort her. She nodded and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Samuel got up from his chair and added more wood to the fire, bringing the flames back to life. He then sat down on the floor near Ayanna, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "It's going to be all right," he said, knowing the words were as much for his own benefit as for hers. "Whatever brought you here, whatever happened to your people, we'll figure something out." Ayanna studied his face in the firelight, and Samuel had the distinct impression that she understood more of his meaning than his actual words. She was clearly an intelligent child, and intelligence was often the key to survival in the harsh world of the frontier. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the cabin's single window, Samuel prepared to face whatever challenges the new day might bring. He had made his choice the previous evening when he decided to help a lost child, and there was no turning back now. Whatever consequences arose from that decision, he would meet them with the same faith and determination that had carried him through all the other trials of frontier life. He had no way of knowing that before the sun reached its zenith, his small homestead would be surrounded by 70 Comanche warriors, or that the next few hours would test every assumption he had ever made about courage, honor, and the possibility of peace between natural enemies. Dawn broke with unusual stillness across the Texas prairie. Samuel had always been an early riser, but on this particular morning, he found himself awake well before his customary time. The events of the previous evening seemed almost dreamlike in the pale morning light, but the presence of the sleeping girl near his fireplace served as undeniable proof that everything had indeed happened exactly as he remembered. Ayanna was still asleep, curled beneath the blanket he had given her. In sleep, she looked even younger than her estimated 11 years, her face peaceful and innocent. The scratches and bruises were more visible in the daylight, telling a story of hardship that Samuel could only guess at. Her injured arm lay carefully positioned to minimize pain, and he noticed that even in sleep, she maintained the alertness of someone accustomed to danger. Samuel moved quietly around the cabin, trying not to wake his guest as he went about his morning routine. He needed to tend to his animals, check his water supply, and assess his food stores. Having another mouth to feed, even temporarily, would require some adjustments to his carefully managed resources. Outside, the morning air was crisp and clear. The autumn sky stretched endlessly overhead, unmarked by clouds, and painted in shades of pale blue that reminded Samuel of his late wife's eyes. Margaret had always loved mornings like this, when the world seemed full of possibility and promise. He wondered what she would think of his decision to help the Comanche girl, and decided that her generous heart would have approved. His livestock were restless, more so than usual. The horses paced nervously in their small corral, their ears constantly moving as they listened for sounds that Samuel's duller human hearing couldn't detect. The milk cows huddled together near the barn, their large eyes reflecting an unease that set Samuel's nerves on edge. Animals, he had learned during his years on the frontier, were often the first to sense approaching danger. Their heightened senses could detect movement, scents, and sounds long before humans became aware of them. The fact that all of his animals seemed disturbed suggested that something was moving across the prairie, something that his domestic creatures recognized as a potential threat. Samuel completed his morning chores with unusual speed, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of movement. The endless expanse of grassland offered numerous places for riders to conceal themselves, particularly if they were skilled in the art of prairie warfare. The Comanche were legendary for their ability to move across open country without being detected, appearing suddenly where they were least expected. When he returned to the cabin, Ayana was awake and sitting by the window peering out at the morning landscape. She had folded the blanket neatly and placed it on the chair where Samuel had spent the night. Her dark eyes were alert and watchful, and Samuel noticed that she kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to enter at any moment. "Hungry?" Samuel asked, miming the action of eating. The girl nodded, but her attention remained focused on the world outside the cabin. Something in her posture suggested that she was listening for sounds that Samuel couldn't hear, waiting for signs that had meaning only to someone raised in the Comanche way of life. Samuel prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with a small amount of precious sugar. As they ate, he tried to engage Ayana in conversation using the limited system of gestures and simple words they had established the previous evening. Through patient repetition and careful observation of her responses, he began to piece together fragments of her story. She pointed to herself and said Ayana clearly, then held up both hands with all fingers extended, followed by one hand with only the index finger raised. 11 years old, Samuel concluded. She then pointed in various directions around the cabin while speaking rapidly in Comanche, her voice becoming increasingly agitated as she continued. Samuel gathered that she was trying to tell him about her people, about where she had come from, and perhaps why she was alone. The emotion in her voice suggested tragedy, loss, or separation of some kind. When she pointed to her injured arm and then gestured toward the door, Samuel wondered if she had been hurt while fleeing from something or someone. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made both of them freeze instantly. From somewhere in the distance came the unmistakable rhythm of approaching horses, multiple riders moving at a steady pace across the prairie. The sound was still faint, but it was growing steadily louder. Ayana's reaction was immediate and telling. She sprang to her feet and moved quickly to the window, pressing herself against the wall so she could look out without being easily seen from outside. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable, and she began speaking rapidly in Comanche, her voice urgent and frightened. Samuel grabbed his rifle and moved to the opposite window, carefully positioning himself to observe the approaching riders without exposing himself unnecessarily. What he saw made his blood run cold. Across the prairie, emerging from a distant line of mesquite trees, came a sight that would have struck terror into the heart of any frontier settler. Dozens of mounted warriors, painted for war, were advancing toward his homestead in a broad line that stretched across nearly half a mile of open ground. Even at a distance, Samuel could see the flash of weapons in the morning sunlight, and the distinctive feathered lances that marked them as Comanche. He tried to count them, but gave up when he reached 50, and realized there were still more emerging from the trees. This was not a small raiding party or a hunting group that had stumbled across his homestead by accident. This was a major war party, organized and purposeful, and they were heading directly toward his cabin. Samuel's mind raced as he tried to process the implications of what he was seeing. The timing could not be coincidental. These warriors were almost certainly connected to Ayana in some way. They might be searching for her, or they might be seeking revenge for some perceived wrong. Either way, Their presence meant that his simple act of compassion had thrust him into the middle of a situation that could easily end in violence and death. He looked back at Aina, who had moved away from the window and was now standing in the center of the room, her injured arm held protectively against her body. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by something else. Resignation, perhaps, or the kind of grim determination that comes from accepting an inevitable fate. "Your people?" Samuel asked, pointing toward the approaching warriors. Ayana nodded, then said something in Comanche that he didn't understand. She pointed to herself, then to the door, and began moving toward it as if she intended to leave the cabin and walk out to meet the war party. Samuel stepped quickly to block her path. He had no idea what the approaching warriors intended, but he was certain that allowing an injured 11-year-old girl to face them alone was not the answer. Whatever was about to happen, they would face it together. "No," he said firmly, gently grasping her uninjured arm. "Stay." Ayana looked up at him with surprise, as if she couldn't quite believe that a white settler would be willing to protect her from her own people. She spoke again in Comanche, her tone suggesting that she was trying to explain something important, but Samuel could only shake his head helplessly. The sound of approaching horses was much louder now, close enough that Samuel could hear individual voices calling to each other in the Comanche language. He estimated that the war party would reach his homestead within minutes, and he still had no clear idea how to handle the situation. His first instinct was to prepare for a fight. His cabin was solidly built, and he had adequate ammunition for his rifle. He could barricade the door and windows and try to hold out until help arrived, though help from other settlers was days away at best. The biting seemed like a poor option when he was outnumbered by at least 70-1, and when the life of the child he was trying to protect hung in the balance. Samuel made a decision that went against every survival instinct he had developed during his years on the frontier. He set his rifle aside and walked to the door of the cabin. Ayana followed him, speaking urgently in Comanche, apparently trying to dissuade him from whatever he was planning to do. "It's all right," Samuel said, though he was far from certain that anything about the situation was all right. "If they want to talk, we'll talk. If they want to fight, well, at least we'll meet them honestly." He opened the door and stepped outside with Ayana close behind him. The morning air was filled with the thunder of hooves and the calls of the approaching warriors. Samuel could see them clearly now, and the sight was both magnificent and terrifying. The Comanche war party was spread across the prairie in a formation that spoke of military precision and years of experience in warfare. The warriors were painted in the traditional manner, with designs in red, black, and white that marked them as members of a specific band and proclaimed their readiness for battle. Their horses were magnificent animals, bred for speed and endurance, and they moved with the fluid grace that came from a lifetime spent in the saddle. At the center of the formation rode a man who was clearly the leader. He was older than most of the other warriors, perhaps in his 40s, and his bearing suggested both authority and experience. Unlike some of the younger men, his paint was applied with restraint, and his weapons were practical rather than ostentatious. When his eyes fell on the small cabin and the two figures standing before it, he raised his hand and called out a command that brought the entire war party to a halt. Samuel found himself facing 70 mounted Comanche warriors from a distance of perhaps 100 yards. The silence that followed their arrival was profound and unsettling. No one moved, no one spoke, and the only sound was the occasional snort of a horse, or the creak of leather as a rider shifted in his saddle. The leader urged his mount forward, moving slowly and deliberately toward the cabin. As he drew closer, Samuel could see that his face was marked by old scars, evidence of battles fought and survived. His eyes were intelligent and calculating, taking in every detail of the homestead and its occupants. When the war chief was perhaps 20 yards away, he spoke in heavily accented but understandable English. "You have something that belongs to us," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the small distance between them. Samuel felt Ayana tense beside him. She said something in rapid Comanche, and the war chief's attention shifted to her. The exchange that followed was brief but intense, with Ayana apparently explaining how she had come to be at Samuel's cabin and the treatment she had received. When she finished speaking, the war chief's gaze returned to Samuel. There was something unreadable in his expression, a mixture of surprise, suspicion, and perhaps a grudging respect. "She says you fed her," the chief said. "She says you treated her wounds and gave her shelter." Samuel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge, and he sensed that a wrong word or gesture could tip it toward violence. "She is my daughter," the war chief continued. "She was taken from our camp 3 days ago by Tonkawa raiders. We have been following their trail, seeking to recover her. We did not expect to find her in the lodge of a white man." The revelation that Ayana was the daughter of a Comanche war chief explained much about the size and organization of the search party. No chief would fail to pursue raiders who had taken his child, and no band would refuse to follow their leader on such a mission. The fact that Samuel had unknowingly been harboring the daughter of one of their enemies put an entirely different complexion on the situation. Samuel cleared his throat carefully. "She was hurt when she came here," he said. "I only did what any decent person would do for an injured child." The war chief studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes searching Samuel's face, as if trying to read his thoughts. Behind him, the other warriors remained motionless, but Samuel could feel the tension radiating from them like heat from a fire. These men were prepared for violence, and the smallest provocation could unleash a storm that would leave his homestead in ruins. "You could have taken her prisoner," the chief said finally. "You could have used her to bargain for your safety, or sold her to the soldiers for gold. Many of your people would have done these things." Samuel shook his head. "She's a child. I don't make war on children." Something shifted in the war chief's expression, a subtle softening that suggested Samuel's words had struck a chord. Ayana spoke again, pointing to her bandaged arm, and then to Samuel. The chief listened carefully, nodding occasionally as she continued her explanation. "She says you were gentle with her," the chief translated. "She says you shared your food even though you have little, and that you slept in a chair so she could rest by the fire." Samuel remained silent, sensing that this was not the time for explanations or justifications. Whatever was going to happen would be decided by factors beyond his control, and his best course of action was to wait and let events unfold. The war chief dismounted and walked slowly toward the cabin, his movements careful and non-threatening. When he was close enough to speak without raising his voice, he stopped and looked directly into Samuel's eyes. "I am Iron Bear, war chief of the Nakona band," he said. "This is my daughter Ayana, whose name means Eternal Blossom. 3 nights ago, Tonkawa raiders attacked our camp while most of our warriors were away hunting buffalo. They killed 2 of our old men and took several horses along with my daughter." Iron Bear gestured toward the assembled warriors behind him. "These men have ridden with me for 3 days and nights, following the trail of the raiders. We found their camp yesterday morning and recovered our horses, but my daughter was not there. The surviving Tonkawa told us they had traded her to white soldiers, but their words proved false when we found the soldiers' camp empty." Samuel began to understand the magnitude of the situation. Iron Bear and his warriors had been pursuing their enemies across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, driven by the desperate need to recover a stolen child. The fact that they had instead found her safe and well cared for in the home of a white settler was almost certainly beyond their expectations. "We followed her tracks to your dwelling," Iron Bear continued. "I expected to find her body, or to discover that she had been taken even further from her people. Instead, I find her treated with kindness by a man who could have profited from her capture." The war chief paused, studying Samuel's face intently. "You have done something that few of your people would do. You have shown mercy to the daughter of your enemy, and you have asked for nothing in return. This is not what I expected to find in the heart of a white man." Samuel found his voice at last. "I couldn't do anything else," he said simply. "She needed help, and I had the power to give it. Her race or her people didn't matter to me. She was just a hurt child who needed someone to care for her." Iron Bear nodded slowly, as if Samuel's words confirmed something he had already begun to suspect. He turned to Ayana and spoke to her in Comanche, his tone gentle and paternal. The girl responded eagerly, clearly relieved to be speaking her own language again. Their conversation continued for several minutes, with Iron Bear occasionally glancing at Samuel as his daughter provided what was obviously a detailed account of her experiences. When Ayana finished speaking, Iron Bear was quiet for a long time, apparently considering something of great importance. Finally, he turned back to Samuel with an expression that was impossible to read. "My daughter tells me that you asked for nothing in return for your kindness," he said. "She says you gave freely of your food and shelter, even though you live alone and have no tribe to support you. She says you treated her injuries with the care of a father, though she is the daughter of your enemy." Iron Bear paused again, and Samuel could sense that some kind of crucial moment was approaching. The other warriors remained mounted and ready, but their leader's demeanor had shifted from one of potential hostility to something more complex and thoughtful. "In our way," Iron Bear said, "when a great service is provided, a great debt is created. You have saved the life of my daughter and restored her to her people. This creates a bond between us that cannot be easily broken." Samuel wasn't sure how to respond to this declaration. The customs and traditions of the Comanche were largely unknown to him, and he had no frame of reference for understanding what Iron Bear might be suggesting. "I don't want anything in return," Samuel said. I did what I thought was right, and that's reward enough for me. Iron Bear smiled for the first time since his arrival, an expression that transformed his scarred face and revealed the man behind the war chief. That is exactly why you deserve the greatest reward we can offer, he said. The Comanche leader raised his hand and called out something in his native language. The response from the assembled warriors was immediate and dramatic. As one man, they dismounted from their horses and began driving the butts of their lances into the ground in a rhythmic pattern that created a deep, resonant sound that seemed to echo across the entire prairie. Samuel watched in amazement as the war party transformed itself from a threatening military force into something that resembled a ceremonial gathering. The warriors formed a large circle around the cabin, their lances creating a temporary fence that enclosed Samuel's entire homestead. What's happening? Samuel asked, though he wasn't sure if he really wanted to know the answer. Iron Bear's smile widened. My friend, he said, we are making you a member of our family. The rhythmic pounding of lance butts against the prairie earth created a sound unlike anything Samuel had ever heard. It seemed to emerge from the very ground itself. A deep, primal rhythm that spoke of ancient traditions and sacred ceremonies that predated the arrival of white settlers by countless generations. The 70 Comanche warriors had formed a perfect circle around his homestead, their painted faces solemn and reverent as they participated in what was clearly a ritual of great significance. Samuel stood transfixed, watching as Iron Bear began to remove items from a leather pouch that hung at his waist. The war chief's movements were deliberate and ceremonial, each gesture carrying the weight of tradition and meaning. Ayana had moved to stand beside her father, her young face bright with excitement, and what Samuel interpreted as pride. Whatever was happening, she clearly understood its importance in a way that he could not. You must understand, Iron Bear said as he worked, that what we are about to do has never been done before. No white man has ever been adopted into our band through the sacred ceremony of brotherhood. The Council of Elders will debate this day for generations to come. Samuel felt a chill of apprehension run down his spine. I appreciate the honor you're offering, he said carefully, but I'm not sure I understand what it means, or what obligations it might place on me. Iron Bear paused in his preparations and looked directly into Samuel's eyes. It means that from this day forward, you will be considered a member of our family, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. My daughter will be your daughter, my sons will be your sons, and my tribe will be your tribe. When we feast, you will feast. When we mourn, you will mourn. When we fight, you will fight. The magnitude of what was being offered began to dawn on Samuel. This was not simply a gesture of gratitude for his kindness to Ayana. Iron Bear was proposing to fundamentally alter the relationship between them, to transform a chance encounter into a permanent bond that would connect Samuel to the Comanche people in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. And what would be expected of me in return? Samuel asked. Loyalty, Iron Bear replied without hesitation. Honesty. The courage to stand with your adopted family when they have need of you. Nothing more, nothing less. Samuel considered this as he watched the preparations continue around him. The other warriors had begun to sing, their voices blending in haunting harmonies that seemed to echo across the entire prairie. Some of the younger men were painting symbols on their horses, while others gathered materials from the surrounding landscape. Stones, branches, prairie grass, and flowers that would apparently play a role in the ceremony. Ayana tugged at her father's sleeve and spoke to him in rapid Comanche, her voice animated and excited. Iron Bear listened carefully, then smiled and nodded his agreement to whatever she had requested. My daughter asks if she may speak to you before the ceremony begins. Iron Bear translated. She wishes to tell you something that she could not express last night when you shared no common language. Samuel nodded his consent, and Ayana stepped forward. She was still favoring her injured arm, but her eyes were bright and alert. She began to speak in Comanche, her words flowing rapidly and with obvious emotion. Iron Bear translated as she spoke, his voice carrying the cadence and rhythm of her original speech. She says that when the Tonkawa took her from our camp, she believed she would never see her family again. She says that during her 3 days as their captive, she was treated with cruelty and contempt, given little food and no care for her injuries. She says that when she escaped and found herself alone on the prairie, she prayed to the spirits of her ancestors to grant her an honorable death, rather than a slow starvation. Ayana continued speaking, gesturing toward the cabin and then toward Samuel. Iron Bear's translation grew softer and more reverent as he continued. She says that when she saw your lodge, she expected to find either death or more cruelty. She says that white settlers have never shown kindness to her people and she had no reason to believe you would be different. But she says that hunger and pain drove her to take the risk, and that when you offered her food and shelter instead of violence, she knew that the spirits had answered her prayers in an unexpected way. The girl's speech grew more emotional, and Samuel could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. Iron Bear's voice remained steady as he translated, but Samuel could detect a note of deep paternal pride. She says that you treated her not as an enemy or a stranger, but as a daughter who had come home after a long and dangerous journey. She says that your kindness healed not only her body but her spirit, and that she will carry the memory of your compassion for all the days of her life. She says that making you a member of our family is not a reward for what you have done, but a recognition of what you already are. A man whose heart knows no boundaries of race or tribe. When Iron Bear finished translating, Ayanna stepped forward and took Samuel's hand in her uninjured one. She spoke a few words in Comanche, her voice soft but clear. She says, "Thank you, Father," Iron Bear translated, and she means it in the truest sense of the word. Samuel found himself deeply moved by the girl's words and by the trust she was placing in him. He knelt down so that he was at eye level with her and spoke as gently as he could. Tell her that helping her was no burden but a privilege. He knelt down so that he was at eye level with her and spoke as gently as he could. Tell her that helping her was no burden but a privilege. He knelt down so that he was at eye level with her and spoke as gently as he could. Tell her that helping her was no burden but a privilege. Tell her that she brought light to a lonely man's home, and that I will always be honored to be called her father. Iron Bear translated Samuel's words, and Ayanna's face lit up with joy. She threw her uninjured arm around Samuel's neck in an impulsive hug, then stepped back with a shy smile. The war chief clapped his hands together, and the singing stopped immediately. The assembled warriors turned their attention to the center of the circle, where Iron Bear began to arrange the items he had removed from his pouch. Samuel could see that they included eagle feathers, small carved bones, stones of various colors, and what appeared to be a clay pipe decorated with intricate designs. The ceremony will have 3 parts, Iron Bear explained as he worked. First, we will bind our spirits together through the sharing of sacred smoke. Second, we will mingle our blood as a sign that from this day forward, you share the blood of our family. Third, we will speak the ancient words that will make you a member of our band in the eyes of both men and spirits. Samuel nodded his understanding, though he was beginning to feel somewhat overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was taking place. This was clearly not a casual or symbolic gesture, but a profound transformation that would affect the rest of his life. The thought of being permanently connected to a Comanche warband was both thrilling and terrifying. Iron Bear began to fill the decorated pipe with a mixture of tobacco and other herbs that Samuel didn't recognize. As he worked, he spoke in a ceremonial tone that was clearly intended for the listening warriors as well as for Samuel himself. "We gathered today on the sacred earth where the spirits of our ancestors walk beside us," he began, his words carrying clearly across the prairie morning. "We gather to witness something that has never been seen before, the adoption of a white man into the Nokona band through the bonds of brotherhood and mutual respect." The assembled warriors began to chant softly, their voices creating a background rhythm that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the earth itself. Samuel could feel the power of their collective presence, the sense that he was participating in something far larger than himself. "This man," Iron Bear continued, gesturing toward Samuel, "has shown mercy to the daughter of his enemy. He has given freely of his food and shelter to one who could have been his captive or his victim. He has proven that the capacity for kindness transcends the boundaries of race and tribe, and that a true man judges others not by the color of their skin or the customs of their people, but by the contents of their hearts." Iron Bear lit the pipe with a burning stick taken from Samuel's fireplace, and the sweet smoke began to curl upward into the morning air. He took several deep draws from the pipe, then passed it to Samuel. "Up, smoke with me, brother," Iron Bear said solemnly. "Let the sacred smoke carry our spirits to the same place, so that we may be joined in the sight of all who watch from the spirit world." Samuel accepted the pipe with hands that trembled slightly. He had never participated in an Indian ceremony before, and he was acutely aware that he was about to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. Once he shared sacred smoke with Iron Bear, he would be bound to the Comanche people in ways that he was only beginning to understand. He drew smoke into his lungs and immediately began coughing. The mixture was far stronger than any tobacco he had ever encountered, and it produced a burning sensation that brought tears to his eyes. Iron Bear smiled at his reaction, but there was no mockery in his expression, only gentle amusement. "The sacred smoke always burns those who are not accustomed to its power," the war chief said. But the burn means that it is working, cleansing your spirit and preparing it for the bond that is to come. The pipe was passed around the entire circle of warriors, each man taking a ceremonial draw before passing it to the next. Samuel was amazed by the solemn reverence with which they approached the ritual. These were the same men who had ridden down on his homestead like a force of nature less than an hour before, but they were now participating in a sacred ceremony with the gravity and dignity of priests conducting a religious service. When the pipe had completed its circuit and returned to Iron Bear, the war chief set it aside and drew a knife from his belt. The blade was beautifully crafted, with an edge that gleamed like silver in the morning sunlight. Samuel felt a moment of apprehension as Iron Bear tested the sharpness of the blade against his thumb. "The second part of the ceremony requires us to mingle our blood," Iron Bear explained. "This is not a token gesture but a sacred bond that will connect us on a level deeper than words or promises. Are you prepared to take this step?" Samuel looked around the circle of watching warriors, then at Ayanna, who was standing nearby with her eyes shining with excitement and pride. He thought about the path that had brought him to this moment. The death of his wife, his decision to build a life alone on the frontier, his choice to help a lost child rather than turn her away. Each decision had led him closer to this unprecedented moment. "I'm ready," he said. Iron Bear nodded and made a small cut on the palm of his left hand. Blood welled immediately from the wound, dark red against his weathered skin. He then offered the knife to Samuel, who accepted it with steady hands. Samuel had cut himself accidentally many times during his years of frontier living, but deliberately drawing his own blood felt profoundly different. He pressed the blade against his palm and drew it across the skin, creating a cut that matched the one Iron Bear had made. The pain was sharp but brief, and he felt an odd sense of ritual satisfaction as his blood began to flow. Iron Bear stepped forward and pressed his bleeding palm against Samuel's, their blood mingling and flowing together, onto the prairie earth below. The war chief spoke in Comanche, his voice rising and falling in what was clearly a ceremonial chant. Samuel didn't understand the words, but he could feel their power and significance. "I have spoken the words that bind our blood together," Iron Bear said when the chant was complete. "From this day forward you carry the blood of the Nocona band in your veins and we carry yours in ours. No force on earth can break this bond, and no enemy can stand between blood brothers." The final part of the ceremony involved the recitation of what Iron Bear called the ancient words of adoption. These were spoken in both Comanche and English, ensuring that Samuel understood exactly what promises he was making and what obligations he was accepting. "Do you swear by the earth beneath your feet and the sky above your head to be faithful to the Nocona band?" Iron Bear asked. "I swear," Samuel replied. "Do you swear to defend our children as if they were your own children, and to honor our elders as if they were your own grandparents?" "I swear." "Do you swear to share our joys and our sorrows, our victories and our defeats, our abundance and our hunger?" "I swear." "Do you swear to never take up arms against the Nocona band, and to never reveal our secrets to our enemies?" Samuel hesitated for just a moment, considering the implications of this final vow. It meant that he could never participate in military actions against the Comanche, and that he would be obligated to keep their confidences, even if doing so put him at odds with his own people. "I swear," he said at last. Iron Bear smiled and raised his hands above his head. "Then by the power of the spirits that guide us, and by the authority of the sacred traditions of our people, I name you blood brother to the Nocona band. You shall be known among us as Stands with the Lost in recognition of your willingness to help those who have no one else to turn to." The assembled warriors erupted in a tremendous cheer that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. They began to sing again, but this time their voices carried notes of celebration and joy rather than solemn ceremony. Several of the younger warriors dismounted and began to dance, their movements energetic and jubilant. Samuel found himself surrounded by Comanche warriors who wanted to shake his hand, embrace him, and offer their personal welcome to the band. He was struck by the genuine warmth of their acceptance, the complete absence of the suspicion or hostility he might have expected. These men, who had been prepared for war when they arrived at his homestead, were now treating him as if he had been their brother for years. Ayanna appeared at his side, her face glowing with happiness. She spoke rapidly in Comanche, and Samuel looked to Iron Bear for translation. "She says that now she truly has two fathers, one who gave her life and one who saved it," Iron Bear explained. "She says that this makes her the luckiest girl in all the Comanche nation." As the celebration continued around him, Samuel reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had taken place in his life over the past 18 hours. He had awakened yesterday morning as a lonely frontier farmer with no family and few prospects. He was going to sleep tonight as the adopted brother of a Comanche war chief, with a new daughter and obligations that extended far beyond his small homestead. The future was uncertain and full of challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in years, Samuel Harrison no longer faced that future alone. He had found family in the most unlikely place, and formed bonds that would endure for the rest of his life. As the sun climbed higher in the Texas sky, the celebration gradually began to wind down. The warriors gathered their horses and prepared to depart, but not before each man had personally welcomed Samuel into their brotherhood. Iron Bear and Ayanna would remain for one more night, the war chief explained, to discuss the practical arrangements of their new relationship and to ensure that Samuel understood exactly what his adoption into the band would mean in terms of future contact and mutual obligations. Samuel watched the warriors mount up and ride away across the prairie, their departure as impressive and organized as their arrival had been. In a matter of hours, his small homestead had been the center of the most significant ceremony in Comanche tradition, and now it was returning to its customary quiet. But the silence was different now. It was no longer the silence of isolation and loneliness, but the peaceful quiet of a man who knew that he belonged to something larger than himself. Samuel Harrison had found his place in the world, even if it was a place he could never have imagined when he first decided to help a lost child who appeared at his door in the gathering darkness. The departure of the war party left an almost overwhelming silence across the prairie. Samuel stood outside his cabin, watching the last of the mounted warriors disappear into the distance, their forms gradually becoming indistinct dots against the vast expanse of grassland. The rhythmic thunder of 70 horses moving in formation faded until only the whisper of wind through the prairie grass remained. Iron Bear and Ayanna sat in the shade of Samuel's cabin, the war chief cross-legged on the ground in the traditional manner while his daughter rested against the cabin wall with her injured arm carefully positioned across her lap. The intimacy of the small group felt strange after the grand ceremony of the morning. But Samuel was grateful for the opportunity to speak privately with his new brother and daughter. "You have questions," Iron Bear observed, his dark eyes studying Samuel's face with the perceptiveness of a man accustomed to reading others. "This is natural. What we have done today has never been done before, and you need to understand what your new life will require of you." Samuel settled himself on the ground nearby, still somewhat amazed by the casual way Iron Bear spoke of his new life. 24 hours earlier, his biggest concern had been whether his small corn crop would see him through the coming winter. Now he was apparently a member of a Comanche war band, with obligations and responsibilities that extended far beyond his small homestead. "I'm honored by what you've done," Samuel said carefully, "but I have to admit that I don't fully understand what it means. How can I be a member of your band while living here? How do I fulfill my obligations to people I may only see a few times each year?" Iron Bear nodded approvingly. "These are wise questions, the questions of a man who takes his promises seriously. The fact that you ask them tells me we chose correctly when we decided to make you our brother." The war chief gestured toward the horizon where his warriors had disappeared. "The Nocona band is not like your settlements, with fixed boundaries and permanent buildings. We follow the buffalo herds in the changing seasons, moving our lodges wherever the land can best support our horses and our people. Sometimes we are near this place, sometimes we are hundreds of miles away." Ayanna spoke in Comanche, her voice animated as she addressed her father. Iron Bear listened carefully, then smiled and nodded his agreement before turning back to Samuel. "My daughter reminds me that geography is not the only thing that defines a family. She says that the distance between our lodges and your cabin matters less than the distance between our hearts, and that true relatives remain close even when they are far apart." Samuel found himself touched by the girl's wisdom. Despite her young age, she seemed to possess an understanding of human relationships that many adults never achieved. "She's right," he said. "But I still need to know what you expect from me, and what I can expect from you. If I'm truly a member of your family, how do we maintain that connection across the distances you're talking about?" Iron Bear shifted his position slightly, settling in for what was clearly going to be a long and detailed conversation. "Among our people, family obligations are both sacred and practical. As my brother, you will be expected to provide shelter and assistance to any member of our band who comes to you in need. If our hunters are unsuccessful and our people are hungry, you will share your food. If our warriors are wounded and need a place to heal, you will tend to their injuries. If our children need protection, you will defend them as if they were your own."
The magnitude of these expectations was sobering.
Samuel's small homestead and limited resources could easily be overwhelmed if a significant number of Comanche refugees appeared at his door seeking assistance. He wondered how he could possibly honor such commitments while maintaining his own survival.
What if I can't provide what's needed? Samuel asked. What if my resources aren't sufficient to help everyone who might come to me? Iron Bear's expression grew serious. A man can only give what he has, but he must be willing to give all of it if necessary. We do not expect you to work miracles, but we do expect you to share whatever you possess with your family members, even if it means hardship for yourself.
The war chief paused, studying Samuel's face intently. But remember that these obligations flow both ways. Just as you will provide for members of our band, so will we provide for you. If soldiers threaten your homestead, our warriors will defend it. If sickness or injury leaves you unable to work your land, our people will ensure that you do not starve. If enemies seek to harm you, they will have to fight all of us to reach you. This reciprocal aspect of the arrangement was something Samuel hadn't fully considered. He had been so focused on what would be expected of him that he hadn't thought about the protection and support he would receive in return. The idea that 70 Comanche warriors considered themselves obligated to defend his small cabin was both thrilling and intimidating. What about other white settlers? Samuel asked.
How do I explain my relationship with your people without creating problems for myself or for you? Iron Bear and Ayanna exchanged glances, and Samuel could see that this was a question they had anticipated. The war chief was quiet for several moments before responding, clearly choosing his words with care.
This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of your new situation, Iron Bear admitted. Your people and mine have been enemies for many years. There has been blood spilled on both sides, and there are those among both whites and Comanche who will never accept peace between us. The war chief gestured toward the cabin and the small homestead surrounding it. You will find yourself caught between two worlds, trusted completely by neither. Some of your people will call you a traitor for showing loyalty to Indians. Some of my people will question whether a white man can truly be trusted no matter what ceremonies he has participated in. Ayanna spoke again, her voice earnest and concerned. Iron Bear translated her words with obvious paternal pride. She says that people who judge others by the color of their skin rather than the content of their hearts are not worth worrying about. She says that anyone who would condemn you for showing kindness to a lost child has forgotten what it means to be human. Samuel appreciated the sentiment, but he was realistic enough to know that the girl's idealism might not be sufficient protection against the practical consequences of his new status. The Texas frontier was a harsh and unforgiving place, where survival often depended on maintaining clear distinctions between friend and enemy. What if soldiers come here looking for information about Comanche movements? Samuel asked. What if other settlers ask me to guide military expeditions or serve as a scout against your people? I've sworn never to take up arms against your band, but how do I honor that oath without exposing myself as a traitor to my own race? Iron Bear nodded grimly. These situations will arise, and when they do, you will have to choose carefully. We do not expect you to lie outright to your authorities, but neither can we allow you to provide information that would be used to harm our people. The war chief drew a small pouch from his belt and removed what appeared to be a carved stone bearing intricate symbols. If you are ever forced into a situation where you must choose between loyalty to your people and loyalty to ours, send this token to us with a trusted messenger. We will know that you are in danger because of your association with us, and we will act to protect you.
The Samuel accepted the carved stone, feeling the weight of its significance.
It was smooth and warm from being carried close to Iron Bear's body, and the symbols carved into its surface seemed to shift and move in the changing light. What does it mean? Samuel asked, examining the intricate designs. It is the mark of our family, Iron Bear explained. Any Comanche who sees it will know that you are under the personal protection of the Nocona band, and that harming you would bring the vengeance of our entire people down upon the perpetrator.
Ayanna reached out and touched the stone gently, speaking a few words in Comanche. Iron Bear translated with a smile.
She says it is a powerful charm that will keep you safe when she cannot be here to protect you herself. She takes her duties as your daughter very seriously. As the afternoon wore on, Iron Bear provided Samuel with detailed information about Comanche customs, traditions, and expectations. He learned about the complex system of obligations that bound family members together, the proper way to address various relatives, and the ceremonies and rituals that marked important events in Comanche life. You will be expected to participate in our seasonal gatherings when possible, Iron Bear explained. 4 times each year, the scattered bands of our people come together to trade, to arrange marriages, to settle disputes, and to make decisions that affect all Comanche. As a member of our family,
You would be welcome at these gatherings, though we understand that your responsibilities here might prevent you from attending.
Samuel tried to imagine himself participating in a large Comanche gathering, surrounded by hundreds of people whose language he didn't speak and whose customs were largely foreign to him. The prospect was both exciting and terrifying.
How would other Comanche react to my presence at such events, he asked. Iron Bear considered this carefully. There will be curiosity, certainly. Many will want to hear the story of how a white man came to be adopted into our band. Some of the older people will be skeptical, believing that no white man can truly be trusted regardless of what ceremonies he has undergone. But most will judge you by your actions rather than your ancestry. The war chief's expression grew more serious. You must understand that being accepted as my brother does not make you Comanche. You will always be a white man who has been adopted into our family, and there will be aspects of our culture that remain closed to you. Some of our sacred ceremonies are restricted to those born into the tribe, and some of our council meetings deal with matters that even adopted members are not permitted to hear. Samuel nodded his understanding.
He had not expected complete acceptance or full integration into Comanche society. The fact that he was being offered any place at all in their world seemed miraculous enough. As the sun began to set on what had been the most extraordinary day of Samuel's life, Iron Bear and Ayana prepared to depart. The war chief would travel through the night to rejoin his band, while Ayana would accompany him after spending one more evening with her adopted father. "When will I see you again?" Samuel asked, surprised by how much the prospect of their departure affected him. In the space of a single day, these two people had become genuinely important to him. "The Nocona band will winter in the valleys near the Brazos River, perhaps 2 days' ride from here," Iron Bear replied. "When the spring grass is high enough to support our horses, we will move north to follow the buffalo herds. But we will send messengers to check on your welfare, and if you have need of us, you have only to send word." Ayana approached Samuel and spoke earnestly in Comanche, her dark eyes bright with emotion. Iron Bear translated her words. "She says that having 2 fathers makes her feel twice as safe and twice as loved. She promises to think of you every day, and she asks that you think of her as well. She says that when the winter winds blow cold around your cabin, you should remember that somewhere to the south, your daughter is sitting by a warm fire thinking of you, and sending her love across the prairie." Samuel knelt down and embraced the girl gently, careful not to aggravate her injured arm. "Tell her that I will think of her every day and that she will always have a home here whenever she needs one." Iron Bear clasped Samuel's hand in the white man's gesture of farewell, then placed his other hand on Samuel's shoulder in the Comanche manner. "You have given us a great gift, my brother," he said solemnly. "You have shown us that it is possible for people of different races to see past their differences and find common ground in their shared humanity. This lesson will stay with us long after the memory of today's ceremony has faded." As Samuel watched his new family disappear into the gathering darkness, he reflected on the profound changes that had occurred in his life. He had awakened that morning as a lonely homesteader with no family and few friends. He was going to sleep as the adopted brother of a Comanche war chief with obligations and relationships that would shape the rest of his life. The challenges ahead would be significant. He would have to navigate the complex relationships between 2 peoples who had little reason to trust each other. He would have to honor competing loyalties while maintaining his integrity and his safety. He would have to find ways to bridge cultural differences that had persisted for generations. But as he settled down for the night in his small cabin, Samuel Harrison felt more hopeful about the future than he had in years. He had discovered that kindness could transcend racial boundaries, that courage could overcome prejudice, and that family could be found in the most unexpected places. The carved stone that Iron Bear had given him sat on his table, its symbols seeming to glow in the lamplight. It was a tangible reminder of the extraordinary events of the past day and a promise that he would never again face the challenges of frontier life alone. Outside, the prairie wind continued to whisper through the grass, but it no longer sounded lonely to Samuel's ears. It sounded like the voices of family calling across the distance, reminding him that somewhere in the vast wilderness of Texas, he had people who cared about his welfare and would come to his aid if he called for them. For the first time in 3 years, Samuel Harrison went to sleep, knowing that he was not alone in the world. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping across the Texas prairie with a fury that caught even experienced settlers by surprise. Samuel watched from his cabin window as snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes that promised to blanket the landscape for days. He had spent the autumn months preparing for the cold season, but his preparations now included considerations he had never faced before. Somewhere to the south, the Nocona band was also weathering this storm. and he found himself worrying about people he had never met, but who were now, somehow, his family. It had been 3 months since the extraordinary ceremony that had made him a brother to Iron Bear and an adopted father to Ayana. In that time, Samuel had received 2 visits from Comanche messengers. Young warriors who appeared at his door like ghosts emerging from the prairie. They brought news of the band's movements, updates on Ayana's complete recovery from her injuries, and gifts of buffalo meat that helped supplement Samuel's winter food stores. Each visit had reinforced the reality of his new status while highlighting the challenges it presented. The first messenger, a serious young man named Swift Arrow, had stayed only long enough to deliver his message and accept a meal before disappearing back into the wilderness. The second, an older warrior called Gray Wolf, had remained for 2 days helping Samuel repair his barn roof in exchange for the hospitality he had received. Both visits had been observed by Samuel's distant neighbors. The Mackenzie family, whose homestead lay 8 miles to the east, had sent their eldest son to inquire about Samuel's Indian visitors. Samuel had explained them away as peaceful traders, but he could see the suspicion in young Tom Mackenzie's eyes.
Word was spreading through the sparse settler community that Samuel Harrison was maintaining friendly relations with the Comanche, and such relationships were viewed with deep distrust. The situation had grown more complicated when Captain James Morrison of the Texas Rangers had arrived at Samuel's door 3 weeks earlier.
Morrison was a hard man with steel-gray eyes and a reputation for ruthless efficiency in his campaigns against hostile tribes. His unexpected visit had tested Samuel's loyalty in ways he had not anticipated.
We're organizing a winter expedition against Comanche raiders who've been hitting settlements north of Austin, Morrison had explained as he sat at Samuel's table, accepting coffee and cornbread with the casual manner of a man accustomed to frontier hospitality. We need scouts who know this country and can read Indian sign. Your name has been mentioned as someone who might be useful to us. Samuel had felt his heart racing as he struggled to find the right response.
He could not participate in military action against the Comanche without violating his sacred oath to Iron Bear, but refusing outright would mark him as a suspected traitor in the eyes of the Rangers. I appreciate the confidence, Samuel had said carefully, but I'm not really qualified for that kind of work. My tracking skills are limited to finding lost cattle and following deer trails. Morrison's eyes had narrowed slightly. Funny thing that.
Tom Mackenzie tells me you've had Comanche visitors here at your place. Says they seemed mighty comfortable, like they'd been here before.
Man who's hosting Indian guests might know more about their movements than he's letting on. The accusation had hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire. Samuel had forced himself to meet Morrison's gaze steadily while his mind raced through possible responses. A couple of hunters stopped by looking for water and a meal, he had said finally. I fed them and they moved on. Didn't seem any point in making enemies when I live out here alone. Morrison had studied Samuel's face for a long moment before nodding slowly. Smart policy for a man in your position, I suppose. Still, if you see any more of these friendly Indians, you might want to get word to the nearest ranger station. Information about Comanche movements could save a lot of white lives. After Morrison's departure, Samuel had sent the carved stone token to Iron Bear with a trusted Mexican trader who regularly moved between the settlements and the various Indian bands. The message was simple. The Rangers were planning a winter campaign, and Iron Bear should take appropriate precautions. Samuel had not provided specific details about troop movements or tactical plans because he didn't possess such information, but he had felt obligated to warn his adopted family about the general threat. Now, as he watched the snow fall and wondered if his message had reached Iron Bear in time, Samuel reflected on the complex web of loyalties and obligations that had come to define his life. The comfortable simplicities of his earlier existence had been replaced by a constant need to balance competing demands and navigate between two worlds that seemed increasingly incompatible. The sound of approaching horses through the snow interrupted his thoughts. Samuel moved to the window and was surprised to see not one or two riders but a small group approaching through the storm. As they drew closer, he could make out 5 mounted figures, all wrapped in heavy blankets, and moving slowly through the deepening snow. Samuel opened his door as the riders reached his cabin, and his heart leaped when he recognized the lead figure. Despite being bundled in winter gear, Iron Bear's distinctive bearing was unmistakable. Behind him rode 4 other warriors, and bringing up the rear was a smaller figure that could only be Ayana. My brother, Iron Bear called out as he dismounted. We seek shelter from the storm and counsel with one we trust. Samuel immediately began helping the travelers stable their horses and bring their gear into the cabin. The animals were exhausted from their journey through the blizzard, and the riders looked nearly frozen despite their heavy clothing. Ayana's face was pale with cold, but her eyes lit up with joy when she saw Samuel. Bother! She called out in accented but recognizable English, throwing her arms around him in an enthusiastic embrace. I have learned your language, so we can speak together. Samuel was amazed by the progress she had made in the 3 months since their last meeting.
Her English was heavily accented and somewhat limited, but it was clear and understandable. The fact that she had made the effort to learn his language so they could communicate directly touched him deeply.
As the group settled around Samuel's fireplace, Iron Bear explained the purpose of their unexpected visit. We received your warning about the soldier expedition, he said.
Our scouts have been watching their movements, and we believe they plan to attack our winter camp within the next few days. Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. How many soldiers? Perhaps 40 rangers and twice that number of volunteers from the settlements, Iron Bear replied grimly.
They are well armed and led by a man known for his hatred of our people. If they find our camp, many of our women and children will die.
One of the other warriors, a middle-aged man with intricate facial tattoos, spoke rapidly in Comanche. Iron Bear listened carefully before translating.
Standing Bear says that some of our young men want to ambush the soldiers before they reach our camp.
They believe we should strike first and scatter the expedition before it can do us harm. Samuel could see the strategic logic in such a plan, but he also understood its potential consequences.
If you attack the Rangers, they'll call for reinforcements from every garrison in Texas. This will escalate into a war that nobody wants. Iron Bear nodded soberly.
This is my thinking as well, which is why I have come to you. You know the ways of your people better than we do.
Is there another way to avoid this bloodshed? Samuel stared into the fire as he considered the situation. The Rangers were expecting to find the Comanche camp in its current location, and Iron Bear was reluctant to move his people in the middle of winter, when such travel could be deadly for the elderly and very young.
An attack on the Rangers would indeed escalate the conflict beyond anything the region had seen before. What if the Rangers found an empty camp? Samuel asked slowly.
What if they arrived to discover that the Comanche had already moved on? Iron Bear tilted his head thoughtfully. Moving our entire band in this weather would be dangerous, especially for our children and elders.
Many could die from the cold. Not the entire band, Samuel said, his idea beginning to take shape. What if you move just the women, children, and elders to safety, while the warriors remained behind to remove all traces of the main camp?
The Rangers would find signs of recent occupation but no people to attack. Ayana spoke up in her improving English.
But where would we move the families?
The next safe valley is 3 days' travel in good weather. Samuel looked around the small cabin, measuring its capacity against the need he was contemplating. How many women, children, and elders would need shelter? Iron Bear considered this carefully. Perhaps 30 people, including Ayana and her grandmother, who is too frail to travel far in the storm.
Bring them here, Samuel said without hesitation. My cabin is small, but my barn is large and warm.
We can house 30 people for a few days if we work together. The warriors exchanged glances, clearly surprised by the offer. Standing Bear spoke again in Comanche, his tone skeptical. Iron Bear translated. He asks how you can shelter 30 Comanche without your neighbors discovering what you have done. He says that such an action would mark you as a traitor to your own people. Samuel had already considered this risk. My nearest neighbors are 8 miles away, and they won't travel in this storm unless there's an emergency.
If we're careful about fires and noise, we can keep your families hidden until the Rangers have come and gone. Iron Bear studied Samuel's face intently. You understand what you are offering? If you are discovered harboring our people, Captain Morrison and his Rangers will show you no mercy. They will consider you an enemy combatant and treat you accordingly.
I understand, Samuel replied, but I also understand that 30 innocent people could die if we don't find a way to avoid this confrontation.
I won't let that happen if there's something I can do to prevent it. Ayana moved closer to Samuel and took his hand in both of hers.
You would risk your life for people you have never met? Samuel squeezed her hands gently. They're not strangers, daughter. They're family. The decision was made quickly, once Iron Bear accepted Samuel's offer. 2 of the warriors would return immediately to the Comanche camp to organize the evacuation, while Standing Bear would remain with Iron Bear to help prepare Samuel's homestead for its unexpected guests. Ayana would also stay, serving as a translator and helping to coordinate the complex logistics of housing 30 people in facilities designed for one.
The next 18 hours passed in a blur of intense activity.
Samuel's barn was reorganized to create sleeping areas for families, with blankets and furs arranged to provide maximum warmth and privacy. His small store of winter food was supplemented by supplies brought from the Comanche camp, creating a communal kitchen that could feed everyone. The refugees began arriving in small groups throughout the second night, traveling through the continuing snowstorm to reach Samuel's homestead. Each group consisted of 3 or 4 people, moving carefully and quietly to avoid leaving obvious trails that could be followed. Samuel was struck by the discipline and organization displayed by even the youngest children, who understood the importance of silence and followed their elders' instructions without complaint. Among the arrivals was Ayana's grandmother, a tiny woman named Morningstar, whose wrinkled face reflected a lifetime of wisdom and hardship. Despite her advanced age and frail health, she had insisted on making the dangerous journey rather than staying behind to face the Rangers. Samuel was honored when Iron Bear introduced him as her adopted grandson, and he was touched by the old woman's immediate acceptance of him into her family.
She says you have kind eyes, Iron Bear translated, after Morningstar spoke to him in Comanche. She says that eyes cannot lie about the contents of a man's heart, and yours show her a person who can be trusted completely. By dawn of the third day, all of the refugees had arrived safely. Samuel's small homestead had been transformed into a temporary village, with 30 people quietly going about their daily routines while remaining hidden from the outside world. The barn buzzed with suppressed activity as families cared for their children. Elders shared stories in whispered voices, and everyone waited anxiously for news of the approaching Rangers.
That news came shortly after midday when Swift Arrow arrived with a report from the warriors who had remained behind to monitor the empty camp. The Rangers had indeed attacked at dawn, finding exactly what Iron Bear and Samuel had hoped they would find: clear evidence of recent Comanche occupation, but no people to fight or capture.
They searched the entire valley, Swift Arrow reported in English, clearly practicing the language he was learning from Ayana. Captain Morrison was very angry to find no one there. His soldiers burned the empty lodges and destroyed what supplies they could find, but they captured no prisoners and killed no one. The relief in the barn was palpable, though everyone remained quiet in case there were still Rangers in the area.
Samuel felt a profound sense of satisfaction at the success of their plan, but he also understood that the danger was far from over. Morrison would undoubtedly search the surrounding area for signs of where the Comanche had gone, and the presence of 30 refugees on Samuel's homestead remained a significant risk.
Iron Bear seemed to read his thoughts. "We cannot stay here much longer," he said quietly. "Every hour increases the danger to you and to my people. But the storm continues, and travel with so many children and elders remains dangerous. Stay as long as you need to," Samuel insisted. "We've come this far safely. We can manage a few more days if necessary."
His confidence was tested that very afternoon when Tom Mackenzie appeared at Samuel's door, riding through the snow on an urgent errand. Samuel had seen him approaching from a distance and had managed to alert the refugees, who quickly organized themselves to remain absolutely silent in the barn.
"Samuel," Tom called out as he dismounted from his exhausted horse. "Thank God you're all right.
We heard there was a ranger raid on a Comanche camp somewhere in this area, and Pa sent me to check on you."
Samuel opened his door and stepped outside, pulling on his coat as he did so. "I'm fine, Tom. Didn't even know there was a raid until just now."
"Everything's been quiet here." Tom looked around the homestead with obvious relief, but Samuel noticed his eyes lingering on the barn. "Good to hear it. Captain Morrison stopped by our place yesterday asking if we'd seen any Indian sign. Said they were tracking a war party that might be moving through this area." Samuel forced himself to remain calm despite the racing of his heart. "Haven't seen anything unusual. This storm has kept me close to home for the past few days." Tom nodded, apparently satisfied. But then his expression grew puzzled. "Strange thing, though. I could swear I smell smoke coming from your barn. Different kind of smoke than you'd get from hay or animal bedding." Samuel's mind raced as he searched for an explanation that wouldn't arouse further suspicion. "Been burning some old furniture in there," he said casually. "Had a broken chair and a damaged table that weren't worth keeping. Seemed like a good time to clear them out." Tom accepted this explanation with a nod, but Samuel could see that something still bothered him. "Well, you be careful out here," Tom said as he prepared to remount his horse. "Morrison thinks there might still be hostiles in the area, and he's got patrols searching everywhere. If you see anything suspicious, you send word immediately." After Tom's departure, Samuel realized that they could not continue to house 30 people without eventually being discovered. The risks were simply too great, and the longer the refugees remained, the more likely it became that someone would notice signs of their presence.
That evening, as the storm finally began to subside, Iron Bear announced that they would begin the journey back to their original winter camp the following morning.
The Rangers had moved on, and scouts had confirmed that the area was clear of military forces. But what about the destroyed camp? Samuel asked.
"You said Morrison burned your lodges and destroyed your supplies. Iron Bear smiled grimly. We are Comanche.
We know how to rebuild quickly, and we cached most of our important supplies in hidden places before the evacuation. Within a few days, our camp will be restored and ready for the remainder of the winter. The final evening at Samuel's homestead took on the character of a celebration. Despite the cramped conditions and the constant need for quiet vigilance, the refugees had maintained remarkably high spirits throughout their stay. Now, with safety assured and return to their normal life imminent, they allowed themselves to express their gratitude openly. Morning Star approached Samuel as he sat by the fire, and through Iron Bear's translation, she delivered a speech that moved him to tears. She says that you have proven yourself to be a true member of our family, not just in words but in deeds. She says that risking your life to protect people you had never met is the highest form of courage, and that the spirits of our ancestors will remember your kindness for all time.
The old woman then pressed a small object into Samuel's hands, a beautifully carved bone amulet that she explained had been made by her late husband many years earlier. She says this will protect you when we cannot be here to do so ourselves.
She says it carries the blessings of 4 generations of our family, and now it will carry her prayers for your safety and happiness. When morning came, the departure of the 30 refugees was as carefully organized as their arrival had been.
They left in small groups throughout the day, with each family taking a different route to avoid creating an obvious trail.
By evening, Samuel's homestead had returned to its normal quiet state, though the barn retained the scent of cook fires and the warmth of human occupation. Iron Bear and Ayanna were the last to leave, staying behind to ensure that all traces of the refugees' presence had been eliminated and to make final arrangements for future contact.
What we accomplished here will be remembered among our people for generations, Iron Bear said as they prepared to depart. You have shown that it is possible for whites and Comanche to work together for the protection of innocent lives. This example may serve as a foundation for future peace between our peoples. Ayanna embraced Samuel tightly, her improving English allowing her to express her feelings more clearly than ever before. You are not just my adopted father now, she said. You are the protector of our entire family. I will tell our children's children about your courage and kindness. As he watched his family disappear into the prairie darkness, Samuel reflected on the extraordinary events of the past week. He had harbored 30 fugitives from military justice, deceived a Texas Ranger captain, and risked his own life to prevent a massacre. By any conventional measure, his actions could be seen as treasonous. But Samuel felt no guilt or regret about his choices. He had prevented bloodshed, protected innocent lives, and strengthened the bonds that connected him to his adopted family. The carved amulet from Morningstar hung around his neck, a tangible reminder that he was no longer alone in the world. The winter storm had passed, leaving the prairie covered in pristine snow that would soon melt under the Texas sun. Spring would come again, bringing new challenges and new opportunities. Samuel Harrison, adopted brother of the Nakona Band and protector of the lost, was ready to face whatever the future might bring. He had found his place in a world where kindness could transcend hatred, where courage could overcome prejudice, and where the bonds of family could stretch across any divide.